pleasure to welcome today the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management, the Sloan School Professor of Economics from the Economics Department at MIT, to present this year's McGee Lecture. The McGee Lecture was funded with an endowment from the McGee family, William and Florence McGee, whose two sons, Thomas and William, attended Vanderbilt in the 1990s and both graduated with degrees in economics. Professor Gibbons is an outstanding scholar in a wide variety of fields. I'm always tempted now to say you should Google him. It's a list that's far too long for me to list. But some of his honors, he's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he's a fellow of the Econometric Society. For the economists in the audience, we know what an honor that is. It's really hard to, it would take time away from Professor Gibbons to list his many impressive articles, but I will say that he's a member of an organization that's attempting to change the world. What more can we ask? And he's written on the garbage can theory. And for the non-economists here, don't be confused. Most of our speakers will not be this interesting.
Thank you, Bob. You're supposed to set a low bar. I'm not in lots of fields. I'm in at most one field, which is organizations, which I think is not really a field. So I'm in 0 fields. Anyway. Okay. So I really talk about and think about only one thing, which is organizations, and so I'm afraid that's what we're going to talk about today. Apologies if you expected or wanted anything else. Not feasible. So in particular, and maybe we'll get to a sort of summary slide at the end, I want to talk about organizational culture, which I think of as sort of the third wave of organizational economics. You know, maybe it started with Marshak and Radner and team theory and the idea that everybody had the same interests, and then we got into situations like agency theory and game theory where people had different interests and things got more political and Arrow's theorem became relevant and things like that. And as I will try to motivate, if not illustrate, I think now's the time that we have to start thinking about culture as this third aspect. Yesterday, for some of you, we talked about a model, half a model, a quarter of a model, a very early stage model. Today we'll talk briefly about a regression, and you can put the two together if you like, but everything I'm doing these days, models, regressions, and experiments, is trying to think about culture. Okay. Now, that said, culture is a very big word. Yesterday I had a slide saying there are 160 definitions at least. And so if you come from a discipline or a subdiscipline that has a definition, I'm surely using a different one. Okay, and so I'd be happy to talk about this, but I'm an economist and I'm going to come from that perspective. Okay, so this is a slide that got invented last week, but I spent a bunch of time talking to the MIT Communications Office and the Boston Globe and the Associated Press and a couple others about what they wanted to call contract theory, and I said, no, I want to think about this as governance. Okay, and it's in these situations of governance that I think culture is going to be important for performance. Okay, that's the connection here. So this is new this week, and let's think about what we teach in Econ 101, at least at first. We have a kind of stylized story about the market, and in the simplest case, the suppliers don't care who's buying, and a very simple case, the buyers don't care who's selling. Now, obviously, we've updated that view a little bit, but these are arm's length, anonymous, if you want, one-shot or spot transactions, and we like the fact that a competitive market produces an efficient equilibrium there. Okay, so that's all good. So I'm not sure how much we teach about governance. So it'd be wonderful if we taught undergraduates about governance. I skipped a number to sort of connote graduate education here, and I didn't put 301, I put 302, right? I don't think this is the first thing we teach graduate students, and indeed, as I've been talking about with some of you, I'm not sure at MIT we teach this stuff anywhere to the first year graduate students. And so one of the questions I want to raise is, should governance be an elective? Or is it maybe, how would we know if it were getting important enough that we should teach a little bit of governance to everybody? So we'll come back to that. So what do I mean by governance? Well, it's sort of the opposite of most of this stuff, right? So we're talking about close-in, specific, often ongoing interactions. Why are they specific? Well, either you and I were well-matched to begin with, or there was learning by doing that made us well-matched, or we've made famous specific investments that made us well-matched. And so we're locked in some way together. We're much better together than dealing with other partners who might have been equivalent long ago. And so, here's the part where I was trying to change the language that the press was using to talk about Hart and Holmstrom. Since the prize statement talked about contract theory, of course the press was talking about contract theory. And that led them to think about formal contracts that might be enforced in a court. And so as a first step, I want them to also think about informal contracts. But really, I want them to think about lots of other instruments besides formal or informal contracts, like control rights and asset ownership and reputation and job design and all kinds of other packages of instruments that we use to try to create economic value in these close-in, specific, maybe ongoing settings. Okay, so that's my loose definition of the governance problem, is how are we going to collaborate better together in a specific situation like this. Okay, so now here's an outline. This magenta color is sort of what I really want to talk about, and I have one slide here putting my cards on the table, but I'll do a little bit of sort of warm-up in here before we get to the real stuff. Okay, so my cards on table. So I spent 2 weeks this summer teaching at Stanford with the sociologist Woody Powell, who had just come back from Paris, where he said, I did this interview in the press, Woody said, and 20 minutes in, they said, okay, that's fine, and we hear what you're interested in and why you're doing it and all that stuff. Tell us who you're arguing against. And so he insisted that when we were teaching in this little program together, he and I would introduce ourselves by saying not only what questions animate your work, but what are you arguing against? And then we made all of the assistant professors, the people we were teaching, tell us, okay, what animates your work and what are you arguing against? Okay, so I wake up every morning with this question in mind, right? How can an economist help a fixed set of people collaborate better together? So I think that's the governance question. Okay. Or I mean to be asking that question in the settings I referred to on the previous slide as governance settings. I added this one. So how might economics change if economists thought differently about organizations? And for many economists, I think just thinking about organizations would constitute thinking differently about organizations. I think we might play a bigger role in practice, right? We might have more to say about what's going on in hospitals and schools and government agencies. 5 weeks ago tomorrow, I was at the New York Fed because they're interested in, they call it supervising, not regulating, but they're supervising the banks. And they wanted to say, can you come down here and we'll bring a bunch of bankers and we can talk about how the bankers ought to change their culture. And I said, that's a big project, we're not going to get that done in a day. Furthermore, I think that's consulting, not a lecture, so we'd have to talk about it differently. And most importantly, I don't think you guys are ready for this until you've thought about your own culture. So I said, I'll come down there and spend a day if we talk about a culture of supervision rather than supervising somebody else's culture. And there are a lot of well-trained economists at the New York Fed, none of whom had any organizational economics or any exposure to the idea of culture in graduate school. Okay, so I think there's something to be said there. And I've told some of you that Esther Duflo gave one of the organizational economics seminars last year on this paper about the Rajasthan police force. And she introduced it by saying, many of you will know that I spent a bunch of my career trying to assess whether we should do X. And in this paper, what you'll see And I expect more and more of my work to be asking instead the question, can we do X? And what she meant was, this is a paper where they had, so the head of the police in the state of Rajasthan, Neena Singh, I think might be her name, is a co-author on this paper. Okay, this woman is now the head of the FBI of India. Okay, so they had all kinds of clout behind them in this paper. And so they did, various experimental interventions, or tried to. And in particular, one of them was, they thought about, well, what would happen if we put community monitors in the police stations? And Jennifer's smiling. Good, right? That's the right answer. So, the force field at the front door of the police stations blew back the intended community monitors so fast that, they couldn't land their treatment. Okay, so you couldn't do the experiment because you couldn't implement the treatment. Because you weren't maybe thinking about the fact that you're trying to treat an organization rather than put cameras in a classroom or something like that. Okay, so those are the questions that animate my work. Okay, so what am I arguing against? And by the time we're done here, in a sense, the whole talk is hiding on this slide, right? So we could stop and turn to discussion almost. But so chapter 3 in prototypical microeconomics graduate textbook. Right? Chapter 1 says we're doing microeconomics. Chapter 2 says this is how we think about consumers. Chapter 3 says this is how we think about firms. Actually, you don't really have to read this chapter. All you have to do is change the variable names and flip the sign and you're done, right? So my graduate education at Stanford Business School had a required class in organizations from Jim March, more about whom in a moment. And if there's one thing I learned from that class is, wow, you should be really careful thinking about aggregates of individuals, like a firm, as though they were, in principle, single, coherent, rational decision makers. So I'm arguing against that. I'm arguing against assuming efficient markets if, and those of you who were there yesterday will see the commonality here, if what would follow from this assumption of efficient markets is that productivity differences between very similarly placed enterprises, whether they're plants or firms or something like that, are instantaneously competed away. Some of you will know that Chad Severson at Chicago has a beautiful JEL papers summarizing lots of evidence that productivity differences are not competed away. So that's what I want to focus on, the case where productivity differences are not competed away. Also, and I've committed this sin more times than I care to admit, I'm worried about assuming that parties can easily get to the efficient equilibrium, let's say in a folk theorem-like set of equilibria or something like that, if what that means is that culture, and the way I'm going to think about culture is as an equilibrium, there's the economics part coming in. If culture is as a consequence of parties being trivially able to zoom to the efficient equilibrium, culture is useless or trivially easy to build, then I'm not buying, right? I'm going to try to argue that these observed productivity differences are due in part to culture differences, and that culture is hard to change, and that we need economic models of why and how culture is hard to change. And so the last one, something's shining here, that says second, not first. So I'm actually worried about this, what we teach implicitly when we tell people the second welfare theorem. All right, so the first welfare theorem is lovely. It says, I don't know if organization scholars know either of these welfare theorems. Here we go. Okay, you're supposed to love, Tim, the first welfare theorem. Okay, so you can just stipulate that you love this after I've done this part. Okay, the first welfare theorem says, if you run this thing called a competitive equilibrium, life works out well in the sense that you couldn't make everybody better off afterwards. We reached a Pareto efficient outcome. Okay, so let's just stipulate, good, you're not. Okay, all right. So then there comes this guy. So this guy actually needs a few more assumptions and is harder to prove, and I think is typically thought of as the meteor theorem. It is a meteor theorem, and I'm worried about what it might be implicitly saying economists' roles in trying to change the world are, right? So it says, well, look, there are actually a lot of allocations of goods and services that are Pareto efficient in that you couldn't make everybody better off. They're not sort of obviously stupid. And here's the good news. If you let me monkey with people's original endowments, and then you can cause one of these competitive equilibria to occur, by monkeying with the endowments in the right way, I can get you to any efficient allocation that you want. Okay, and so you know, it's at the bottom because I thought of it last, relatively recently, a couple of weeks ago. But I worry that what that tells first-year students is economists' main and maybe even easy way to intervene in the world is to cause competitive equilibria to happen. And so then, you know, there are posters for Al Roth everywhere I go here, right? Where's that, right? Where's market design, right? Where is trying to help a fixed set of people collaborate together, like in an organization, yeah? So I want to be about ways that economists could help people get to efficient allocations that have nothing to do with building competitive equilibria, in part because we don't remotely have the infrastructure that would be needed to start building prices. And so to be concrete, you know, if we go back here, I'm as interested in Eleanor Ostrom as I am in Oliver Williamson, even though I went to Prize Week in 2009 to talk about Williamson at the committee's request. I came away in love with Eleanor Ostrom, right? I think the problem of we are 40 families living around a lake and overfishing it, now what, is a super important problem. And trying to build a competitive equilibrium doesn't seem to be the way forward for those people. Okay. Okay. So those are my cards on the table. Myrna.
Yes, I agree with everything except the first item under what are you arguing against?
Okay.
Okay, I think individuals should not be seen as individuals.
Yes, yes. No, I think I slipped in a couple of words. Ostensibly coherent and rational individuals, right? So I think you're just sort of squaring my objection, actually.
Okay, I agree.
Right?
That's fine.
So let's just go the first step with me
Okay.
that says, however your individuals are, I'll come to a slide where I'm going to say the problems I'm interested in are environments much more like Arrow's theorem and much less like the Shapley value. Okay, getting to efficient collaboration is hard. And what the Shapley value does is, you know, you're going to get to the efficient frontier, and the only question is how are we going to divide it up?
Right.
Okay, so I want to think about Arrow's theorem type. Dictators might not be so bad. Cycling might not be so bad. We are in tough environments, okay? Not the Shapley value environment. And if you want to go behavioral at the individual level, that's the next step.
Yeah,
I'm
and
not
the
gonna do that.
individual is created by his society to a large extent.
So that's
And
interesting,
that
which
goes
is
back
related to yesterday's talk.
Tibor
right?
Stokowski's The Joyless Economy, do you know that book?
I know that title, but,
Great.
yep.
Not the economics, the second part of it.
All right, you'll teach it to me over dinner?
Sure.
Okay, excellent. All right, so, okay. So how many of you are economists, right? I said we're gonna, maybe I should have asked how many are not. You're not, okay. How many people are willing to raise their hand as not an economist, David List? Here we go. Ah, Elizabeth. Okay, a minority. There we go. All right. Well, even political scientists know an organization when they see one, right? So regardless of your background, you know, first of all, you should listen to Ken Arrow anytime you get a chance. Second of all, if you're at all interested in organizations, this 1974 book is just absolutely beautiful, in English, little, short, and, you know, far from plumbed at this point. But, he says, organizations are trying to achieve collective action, right? We're trying to collaborate in a situation where somehow, you know, it's more like Arrow's theorem and less like the Shapley value. Something about the price mechanism isn't going to work so well. And what do? They allocate resources not through supply and demand, right? So there are lots of ways to do that, dictator, planner, committee, and there are lots of organizations beside firms, which is why I was talking about hospitals and schools and government agencies and all that. And then, well, yeah, briefly, so what could organizational economics look at? We'll come to both sides of this, but there are questions about the boundary of the firm, make or buy, and why is DuPont in chemical and rubber and explosives, and what about long-run contracts between firms and joint ventures. But of course there's also a within organizations part over here about culture and leadership and careers, and should we be a functionally organized or divisionally organized or matrix organization and so on, and then there are lots of organizations beside firms. And then there's this lovely paper by Herbert Simon in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, where he imagines a Martian that zooms in with this special telescope and sort of surveys the Earth. And what this telescope reveals is an economic interaction between two people happening, so to speak, in a market, where perhaps they're in separate firms, or there's just separate individuals at a bazaar or something like that. Or is it happening inside an organization, which might be a firm, but we could imagine other things. And the Martian does this big survey and ends up asking, why do you call this thing a market economy, right? So much is happening in organizations. And I would love, somebody's census of manufacturers type real evidence on this, right? Do we know how much of economic value is created in firms rather than in markets, for example? Right? Yeah, Margaret, yes, do we know?
Do we really know the difference between happening inside an organization
Excellent,
and happening at the
excellent.
boundary?
Okay. Let me come to, so that would be a problem for measurement, but it's not a problem for theory. Let me go to the theory. So, okay, which is this part, right? So I now will give you like organizational economics, not 101, just 001, right? What are the two sides and where did they come from? And just as a way to get going, right? To get to why I'm so convinced that we need to think more about environments like Arrow's theorem and less about environments like the Shapley value, okay? Okay, so you'll see that hope you can see these colors as slightly different. There's a green and a purple, and that purple is slightly different from this bright purple. That's what you're supposed to see. And the point of all of this is that there's sort of a sample selection going on, right? So I've called these pictures in an earlier version, Coase meets Heckman, okay? And so they motivate the idea that you may think that organizations are performing badly, and they might actually be performing worse than the markets that you see, but that's not because the markets are better than the firms, it's because the firms are handling hard problems. Where you see the markets working, it's because they're handling easy problems, and the firms where you see them are doing better than the markets you're not seeing. Okay, so you need to do a Heckman-like sample selection correction in some way to think about the relative merits of integration versus non-integration. Okay, but just to put some more Nobel Prizes into the mix here, right, so things happened slowly in terms of economics starting to think about organizations. You can see more about this. John Roberts and I wrote about it in the introduction to the Handbook of Organizational Economics. And then stuff picks up quickly, starting in the 80s. Footnote, why do we think that is? Why do I think this is? I think it's because we had invented for us game theory that we could use in applied theorizing about organizations. So there are very few models as you go through here. Here's one. And once the game theory got invented in the early 80s, we were off to the races. Okay, so that's why I think there's a big uptick. All right, so I think lots of people know about Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson, for example, right? So in fact, when Oliver Hart teaches organizational economics, he says, this is the field, right? Is there an animating question over here? Who posed it? What came next? And many of the students already know the answers to this before they get exposed to Oliver, right? It's something like, it's Ronald Coase who started this. He asks something like, if firms are so good, if markets are so good, why would we need firms? And then there follows a bunch of work by Oliver Williamson and Klein, Crawford, and Alchian, and Grossman, Hart, Moore, and there's a references slide at the end if you want it. And I might update this a little. I think these days, we don't talk about markets, actually, and we don't talk about firms, actually. We talk about authority, bosses, and the narrower kind of contracts that you could imagine in some simple supply and demand model. right? I'll take 6 of your widgets for $12, that kind of contract, right? So if contracts were so good, why would we need to be giving people authority in any of these economic interactions? Okay, so I think lots of economists know that development, at least at a little distance maybe. And I'm embarrassed to say that, I grew up, I wasn't thinking about this boundary of the firm stuff. I grew up on this side, and it's very recently, like in the last 5 years, not the last 40 years, that it even occurred to me to ask, is there an animating question over here, and if so, who posed it and what came next? Okay? So let's go over there. Is there an animating question for internal organization? If so, who posed it and what came next? So for the economists, I think, some economists would say, well, Bengt Holmstrom wrote a paper on delegation in 1984. And Paul Milgram and John Roberts wrote a paper on influence activities in organizations, kind of lobbying the boss. And Jean Tirole wrote a paper on collusion in organizations, right? So that, economists do stuff on internal organization issues. But very few people have any examples of this kind of thinking before, let's say, 1984, right? And you could say, oh, Holmstrom 79 or something. But okay, so I think that it's Jim March, right? I think that, and we could talk about the difference between what Jim March thought and what Herbert Simon thought, and I think that's an interesting discussion, actually. But what March at least taught me is that these organizations that look like they're fumbling around, that often an organization can look dumb even when the people aren't. Okay, so when GM is stumbling along and needs a bailout, do we think it's full of idiots for 30 years? If you do, I think you better rethink, right? I think it's handling a hard problem, and think about your own department. Right? Think about your own marriage. Think about your own, right? There are lots of situations where smart people wind up inside the frontier, right? Collaboration is hard. Okay, and so we'll talk for a little bit about a 1962 paper, not so much about a 1966 paper, and the book by Sired and March in 63. And if you want to hear more about this, we had a 50th birthday party for the Sired and March book in 2013, and I tried to write about that, so you can find that there. Okay, so here's the title of March's 62 paper. So March was a political scientist, right? So was Herbert Simon. And he writes his paper, The Business Firm as a Political Coalition. Okay, this is exactly the perspective that I want to look at. And again, you could tell me, well, the Shapley value, that kind of efficient bargaining among groups of people, it has coalitions, right? And we work our way up to the coalition of the whole. Well, that's not the kind of coalition that March and Sired and March have in mind. So what they say, and here's, me arguing against chapter 3, they're arguing that the business firm is a coalition without a generally shared, consistent set of goals. So the manager must predict and attempt to manipulate, this is 1963, manipulate his own firm. Okay, that the project of getting an organization to get something done is an enormous part of the managerial task. So why is that, right? If you come from, agency theory and you think, well, doesn't the CEO just write an incentive contract for all the agents or something? And, if you have not so smart a CEO, maybe they don't write such a good contract, but what does the CEO do after 9:30 on Monday morning? Go to the golf course, right? So where is, management as a verb here, right? It's here. It's building and sustaining a coalition. Okay, so this literature that March started in 62 was basically over. This is part of organization theory, right? And it's basically over by 20 years later. And this is a paper by Martha Feldman and Jim March looking backwards and summarizing everything. So they give 6 little vignettes about organizations that are looking dumb, right? And then they have a little footnote that says, we could have given you 6,000 vignettes. I think it says, this list could be extended as long as you like, or something like that, right? So it's very easy to come up with settings where we think the organization is looking dumb. And so they say, well, okay, so I'm considering these phenomena. You could conclude that organizations are systematically stupid. Okay, so that's exactly the point of view I do not want to endorse. Right? I want to say instead, nope, they're handling the hard problems. This is better than the alternatives. And this is where management comes in, and even this is where economists can help by changing the equilibrium, changing the culture. So either you think that organizations are systematically stupid, or you try to discover why reasonably successful and reasonably adaptive organizations might look dumb. Okay. All right, so now let me talk about how to put these together, and this is the Coase meets Heckman part, right? So Coase again said, if markets were perfect, why would we need firms? A more modern statement is, if contracts were perfect, why would we need bosses? The corollary that I want to talk about here is, Coase is saying markets aren't always perfect, so we need firms. We are saying contracts aren't always perfect, so we need bosses. Where contracts aren't perfect, bosses are not immune to problems that wreck contracts. Okay, there's your sample selection problem. And so I want to talk about it in this kind of setting. If we start here, imagine that we're trading over here a 5-pound bag of salt. Imagine that we're trading over here an idea. Okay, 5-pound bag of salt is relatively easy to trade. Your value for the 5-pound bag of salt is $10. My cost of producing it is $2. You probably don't need to bring armed guards to the transaction. You probably don't need to invest in a PhD in chemistry. You might want to make sure I didn't put gravel in the bottom and salt only on the top or something, right? And so what we're plotting here is how hard is the transaction, bag of salt idea, and then how much of the potential gains from trade are we capturing versus how much is lost through investing in lawyers and armed guards and PhDs to evaluate and all that stuff. So we don't lose very much for the 5-pound bag of salt. We're almost getting that whole $8 of surplus when it's worth 10 to you and costs me 2. Whereas, if I'm trying to sell you an idea, can you be sure that I don't sell it again to somebody else or keep it for myself, or are you sure that I even told it to you in a coherent way, took your money and run, and maybe you now do need a PhD in this area, and so on and so on, right? And so the safeguards and reliance investments and so on are much bigger here, and so we lose some of that gains from trade of 10 minus 2 equals 8, and we achieve a smaller percentage effectiveness. So, okay, now I'm going to say in this curve so far, that effectiveness is falling because I'm going to order the transactions. This is without loss of generality, right? I'm going to order the transactions so that being further to the right means you lose more of the potential gains from trade. Now, what I mean by non-integrated is you and I are in 2 separate firms. And so you might look at this when we're getting out here and say, wow, we're not very effective. We're losing a whole bunch in these. We've got to hire lawyers and armed guards and a PhD and da-da-da. So maybe we can do better, right? What happens if, Andy comes along and buys you and me, and so we're both working in the same firm, and he says, cut out this nonsense. Okay, so probably the single best sentence from Oliver Williamson, in my opinion, is in his 1971 AER paper, rather early. I'm not quite saying you should stop reading there, but it's a very good paper, where he says, sometimes fiat is more efficient than haggling. Okay, sometimes having somebody just say, cut it out, right? Including the downsides of anointing a dictator who, might have his own interests and so on. And so here, Andy says, would you stop it with the lawyers and the investing in the PhDs and, blah, 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 blah. So, now, but here I don't know for sure that this is falling monotonically because I don't get to reorder the transactions here. So this is just an illustration. But if it looks like this, then Coase comes along and says, oh, I get it, these are the transactions where the market handles them better. These are the transactions where integration handles them better. I should have said non-integration handles them better over here. And then Heckman comes along and says, I hope none of you are making the mistake of comparing this level of effectiveness for organizations to that level of effectiveness for non-integration, because you're obviously comparing apples to oranges, right? And so the point of this picture is the comparisons are vertical, and you're making a mistake if you compare horizontally and, you know, if you're a hackman, you propose a way to Mills ratio your way out of that. Okay, so this is what I mean by situations where governance is hard, and you might even want a dictator, versus situations where we have lovely contractibility, we will get to the frontier, and the only issue is how to divide it up. Okay? Okay, now, that's the background. So we've talked about Williamson, we've talked about March, we've talked about sample selection, and actually, it's still kind of low, right? There's a big gap between first best 100% effectiveness up here and this level, and indeed, this thing could go up too, right? So what I want to turn to for the rest of the talk is how to help these fixed set of people collaborate better together. Okay, whether we're 2 or 3 people inside a firm, or we might be 2 firms in a long-run supply relationship. Okay, and the idea, you know, one of the lawyers that has influenced me at some point said, no contract in the world will compel an unwilling partner to perform. Okay, so I just despair of writing a smarter and smarter formal contract over here to cause our supply relationship to achieve first best levels of performance, right? And that message came at a time when I was doing lots of work with Merck about their joint ventures and alliances with biotechs in Cambridge, Mass. And other pharmaceutical players worldwide. Merck's view was, of course we write a formal contract, but our best deals are those where we manage to put it in a drawer and build a relationship on top. Okay? That build the relationship on top is this green arrow. Just like managing to improve the performance of our organization after Andy bought us, I'm going to represent as changing our culture, building a better equilibrium inside the organization. Okay, so that's all the preamble. Good time to pause. We're very usefully active and asking questions before. It's late, right? We might get everybody to stand up and turn around and do jumping jacks or something. I see too many eyes almost closing here. Or you could just elbow your neighbor. Right? All right. Thoughts, concerns, questions?
So could you have reformulated or redone the talk you gave yesterday in terms of incomplete contracts?
If I had been smarter, I would have asked to do yesterday's talk tomorrow. Right? Lots of this is sort of the preamble for yesterday, which, as I say that sentence, reveals how dumb I was, right?
Doing this memento.
Yes. So, yeah, right. Okay, so yes, we talked about culture yesterday. We talked about some relational contracts yesterday. Let me say a little bit more about that. But what I want to get to today, yesterday we were trying to get to a model. What I want to get to today is a regression. And yet what I also want, this stuff, I thought to myself, gee, that's more appropriate for the, if I get 22 minutes to tell a broad audience how I hope they'll think about organizational economics, I just did. So I chose to do that today and not yesterday, right? So that's how we got to where we are. All right. And so where we're headed is a regression, and Tim knows this stuff well. It's about bloodstream infections in intensive care units in hospitals. And you don't want to get one because you'll die, and if we can figure out how to reduce their incidence, that's a really good thing. And I want to talk about evidence that a culture change exercise has a big effect on reducing bloodstream infections and how that might look. And that I hope at least the economists in the audience go, yeah, and if that regression is really true, maybe I can interpret this as they built a new equilibrium. And that's really where the economics is coming in here. Okay. All right, so to get there, we have to talk a little bit about the informal, right, what do you do with incomplete contracts? Well, the incomplete formal contracts, maybe you add informal contracts. And so here's Mark Granovetter, the enormously eminent economic sociologist, who tells that observers who assume firms to be structured in fact by the official org chart are sociological babes in the woods. So we wouldn't want to be that, right? Okay, so this says the informal is a very big deal. And actually, George Baker and Kevin Murphy and I have 6 papers that explore this, all of which were written long after 1962, but these sociologists, Peter Blau and Dick Scott, were all over the idea that not just the formal and the informal coexist, but they interact. And so the economist in you, me, someone, says, okay, let's pick, if they interact, let's pick the formal to support the best relational. And now you're kind of back to Merck, right? We're going to write a formal contract and then build a relationship on top. So what should that formal contract say if the point is not the formal contract per se, but the ability to then build a relationship on top? Okay. All right, so what is the, so these guys are talking about the informal aspect of organizations. I've been mumbling about relational contracts. What is a relational contract? How about a promise you can believe in? Or, all the way down here, for theorists in the audience, the equilibrium of a repeated game with transfers. But, here's my favorite definition is definition 2. A shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. Because bosses have discretion, absolutely. But frankly, everybody has discretion. Like what is working to rule by a workforce? An exercise of discretion. Yep. So, in fact, the regression I want to talk about bloodstream infections in intensive care units is all about, do nurses exercise their discretion to say, hey, Dr. Gibbons, you didn't wash your hands? If I am told that, what do I do about it? And so on, right? And so, we're not doing agency anymore, right? This is not about formal contracts. This is not about inducing effort and moral hazard from an agent by means of a formal contract. This is about, closer to repeated Cournot duopoly, where in Cournot duopoly, the firm's discretion is what quantities to put on the market. Well, so this is now inside an organization. What things can the nurses choose to do and not do? What things can the doctors choose to do and not do? Shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. Okay, and so on the one hand, these relational contracts are meant to be these arrows, right? They're meant to say, oh, this is kind of dysfunctional, even this is kind of dysfunctional, can we do better? Just like 2 Cournot duopolists will say, yeah, this static Cournot equilibrium that we're playing here, well, it's better than perfect competition, at least we're making some money, but could we collude in a repeated game and act like each halves of a monopolist, right? So that's a response to dysfunction if you want, but then the March and Sireton March stuff is supposed to say, you know what, and it's not so easy. You don't just show up Sunday night and say, let's play this fancy equilibrium from the repeated game. The key task of the manager is to build and sustain the coalition, right? So there's a managerial task around building and sustaining one of these equilibrium. And I should say, all of this work, I guess I said this yesterday, but lots of you weren't here yesterday, came from more than 10 years of working with Rebecca Henderson, who said, I'll repeat, at a certain point, she knew that Baker and Murphy and I were doing this stuff on relational contracts. She goes out and not only looks at the world, but changes the world. She gets amazing consulting rates from organizations that need her. And she comes back and says, Gibbons, this relational contract stuff is more important than you know. Yeah? And that's half insult and half compliment, right? So you're just a stupid theorist, but you're on a good track, okay? So, all right, so now we're going to continue. Okay, so let's see if we can do this in 6 minutes and then we get to the regressions. So this part is repeated from yesterday, but it's important. It turns out that there are measured performance differences from seemingly similar enterprises. It turns out that measured management practices are correlated with those performance differences. And Rebecca's insight, it turns out that many of those management practices rely on promises. And so this is a picture of 40 large kitchens next to 40 large US airports. They're all making chicken lasagna back in the late 1980s. And the raw productivity differentials between the worst and the best are 3 to 1, and after you control for lots and lots of things, the productivity differentials are 2 to 1. So within a firm, okay, you're seeing very big productivity differences. I mean, you know, if you think about Kaiser, right, and Kaiser's in Northern California and Southern California and Northwest and Mid-Atlantic and Colorado. Now, you know, there are different people and so on, but they're trying to defeat those practices, right? And they encounter the problem of how come we can't make our Mid-Atlantic operation perform as well as either our Northern or Southern California operation. Okay, so within a firm, you could tell me they're not quite in one firm, but you get the idea. Okay, so then there's the stuff by Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen, and we'll come to their work with their co-author Rafaela Sadoun, but these people are measuring management practices, and it looks like, I'll do this way too quickly, but let me just commend their work to you and come to the paper of theirs that I love best in a moment. Turns out that if you go and try to measure management practices, they measure 18 of them, they score them each from 1 to 5, and then these are US manufacturing firms, and they find big differences in the scores, the average score of the firm's management practices. And you might think, oh, forget it, this is garbage in, garbage out, until it turns out that these management scores are correlated with stuff we care about, like profitability and Q and survival. Okay. And so then Rebecca comes along and says, yeah, and a lot of management practices rely on promises. So for example, Lincoln Electric has not only a formal piece rate or an enforceable contract that tells me how much I get per unit of output I produce, but it also has a discretionary bonus that rewards the softer things like ideas and cooperation and dependability. And I think more importantly, I think the big push, the big value added from relational contracting in organizations is not about incentives, it is about empowerment, it's about discretion, right? So I know how the boss really empowers me. Sell me off, spin me off, let me be my own organization. Okay, so in a so-called empowered, you know, how empowered are department heads? Okay, you know, in principle. Right, so not as empowered as if they were, you know, across the street running their wholly owned enterprise, right? At the end of the day, empowerment is a promise from the top down, okay? So, and very important for productivity. Okay, so that's what a relational contract is. It's an economist way of thinking about some of the informal aspects of organizations. It's a promise you can believe in. It's a shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion. And wow, are there measured performance differences in organizations that seem to be related to management practices, some of which are not, I'll call them light switches, although I don't see any light switches here, right? And what I mean by that is, you know, if you discovered that your firm was behind, or your plant was behind, you might discover that, oh, you know, you do a site visit and the other plant or the other firm, they've got the lights on in a different pattern. And you go, oh, well, now I know the secret sauce, and you go back and you unproblematically copy and implement in your place, okay? If you discover instead that at Johnson & Johnson, somehow the people lower down in the organization feel like most of the time we are allowed to run our own show, although we understand that there are times, to our regret perhaps, when the boss has to come in and say, actually, I have to overrule you here. Yeah? That's harder to copy. If you walk in and discover that, there we go, I asked the wrong person how empowered our department is. If you walk in and discover that, you know, so I walk into Vanderbilt and I think, wow, you know, look at this, right? There's an important decentralization and people are acting on it, and political science is flourishing because it's being given some free rein here. And I go back to my place and I say, that's what we need to do. And, you know, who am I? Well, if I'm the dean and I go, I got religion at Vanderbilt and we're going to do empowerment, but I haven't been acting like that previously, you know, who knows how that message is received? Or even, come on, Bob, right? Aren't there limits to this? Can you help express, how far this is gonna go, right? So it's just not easy to copy a well-working promise. It's not easy to solve the credibility problem, and it's also, and more importantly, not easy to solve the clarity problem. What am I intending to promise when I come back from my site visit to Vanderbilt and I go, I've seen the light, we're gonna be decentralized. Okay, so very different. Sir?
So just one question. So, like, are you talking, like, what are you saying that, in the whole effectiveness versus transaction difficulty graph, we should draw a third line, or are you saying that
Good.
we should break down complex transactions into smaller transactions and put them at like different,
Good.
parts of the
And
graph?
what would that third line be? Neither is my answer, but
Yeah,
go on.
like, half integrated, half
Oh,
non-integrated.
interesting. Okay, so
Is that what you're saying?
not quite. But I like where you're going. So it's kind of a lot of, let's find it. Yeah. Choose your formal structure. Andy owns both of us. Or forget Andy, you and I are separate firms. Or forget Andy, you and I are separate firms, but now we're doing really badly, right? And say, well, if we're going to work with each other for the long future, can we repeated game our way to better collaboration than we could if we were doing this one shot, right? And so, did you raise your hand about being an economist or not? I forget.
I'm not a-
You're not, okay. So
As you can
there's,
probably tell from my-
no. So there's plenty of stuff about, why the shadow of the future could discipline what could have been bad behavior today in these repeated game models in economics. And I do think it's related to what the sociologists on some earlier slide were talking about in terms of how the informal aspects of organization might help. Of course, there could also be collusion, and so they might hurt. And that prospect that there are good and bad equilibria, good and bad productive and unproductive uses of the informal side of organizations, is already a suggestion that it's not so trivial to get to the good ones. Okay, so I want to get to this regression in a very specific hospital context that I think will help ground ideas, right, about changing the culture.
So how should I be visualizing, informal contracts on this graph?
Moving them up, okay? This is the picture of what you could do in a one-shot interaction. It's kind of trivial on my part, sorry, that life might be better if we also had a future together, because maybe I wouldn't game you so badly today, right? So you're calculating that I get on an airplane tomorrow morning. Okay, so that's what we're trying for, but it ain't easy to move up those lines. Okay? Okay. So, culture. Let's get to culture. There we go. Culture. At least the part of culture I want to assert that building a shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion is important for organizational performance and may as well be called culture, even though we can also call it a repeated game equilibrium. Okay? So I'm sure there are lots of other things that should be called culture, and I can't even tell you what they all are. Okay, so let's slow down here. Good, so we have 18 minutes. We will make it through the regression. This is good. So here's, I don't know, what was it there, 160 definitions of culture? Here's definition 142 or something like that. This is not the kind of culture I want to talk about, but it's very important, right? So the sociologist Hofstede was working for IBM and looked at the sales and marketing offices of IBM in 37 different countries. And he says, this is IBM, right? And this is, I think this book is in 1980, right? So this is IBM in the 70s. So everyone at IBM is wearing a white shirt and, blue tie maybe, or whatever they're doing, right? And so, there are all these forces for conformity at IBM, and yet these 37 different sales and marketing offices in these 37 different countries are organized and performing kind of differently. And he goes, what's up with that? And then he says, and they kind of are coming in clumps. So offices 1, 3, 5, and 7 in countries 1, 3, 5, and 7, they look kind of similar. And 21 through 25, they look kind of similar. And then he says, I think it's the countries. I think it's the big, slow-moving, external country culture seeping into the organization. And so he goes off and he dimensionalizes national cultures and says, oh, the reason that offices 20 through 25 look so similar is that they're in countries that have a similar kind of culture. And the reason that 1, 3, 5, and 7 look similar to themselves and different from 20 to 25 is that they're in countries. Okay, so this is a real thing, and here's it. I love this paper. So this is now Bloom, Sadun, and Van Reenen. So they look at multinationals, and they look at the plants of these multinationals in other countries. So they look at the World Values Survey, and they ask, does the average person in France trust the average person in Belgium? How much? How little? Does the average person in France trust the average person in Britain? Bless you. How much? How little? And then they correlate it with, they ask how well does that correlate with how much discretionary spending limit does a multinational headquartered in France give to a plant that's in Belgium versus to a plant that's in the UK. Okay, and you get a very nice correlation between these external to the organization, centuries-old, slow-moving trust score things and actual organizational decisions like how much discretionary spending is obviously they don't trust the Brits as much as they trust the Belgians. The Belgian plant managers get higher discretionary spending. Okay, and it's not just for France. They have a big sample of multinationals. Okay, so I love that, but it's not what I want to talk about, right? That feels like something a manager ought to know, but not something a manager can do so much about. Okay, so this is the guy you need if you want to do something about it. Or this is anyway my reading of, yeah, but he's from MIT, so I'm probably biased. Okay, so Ed Schein wrote the first book. He actually wrote the first book on organizational psychology too, which has hardly any mention of culture, it turns out, in the 60s. And then this is the 4th edition, but in '85 he wrote the first edition of this book called Organizational Culture and Leadership. And the point of this book is that those two things, culture and leadership, need to be thought about together. Okay, it's not like he has first half and a second half of this book and he's treating two topics just because he wanted to. The point is that leadership is the fundamental process by which organizational cultures are formed and changed, right? So Schein is asking the complementary problem. You've got who you've got. You have one from the UK and one from Belgium and one from France. Now what? Can you help them? It's the question that animates me. How can you help them collaborate better together? Right? What would that look like? Okay. So I want to talk about equilibria as being part of culture, and I want to talk about, ideally, leaders as helping to build equilibria. Okay, so, oops, seems like we already did that, sorry. There we go. Okay, so this is work that is going slowly, all my fault. It went quickly for a while, and then we got rejected by the New England Journal of Medicine, and I was so shell-shocked that I've done nothing, so I need somebody to tell me to get back in gear here. Okay, and it's work with a few economists and some health services, health sciences researchers and some doctors, one of whom is Peter Provost from Hopkins, who I'll say is the checklist guy. More on that now. Okay, so Pronobost's father passed away in the Hopkins Hospital. Provost is he's an intensivist. He's an anesthesiologist who runs ICUs. And it wasn't anywhere near Peter's domain where his father passed away, but he was very moved by this, and he said, what could I do to stop errors, basically, in the hospital? Well, I work in the intensive care units. Bloodstream infections shouldn't be happening, and let's see if we can reduce them. Okay? And so the first thing they did was this evidence-based checklist, which you'll see is not rocket science. Like, would you please wash your hands? Okay, so if you're in the ICU, you're sick. You really don't want to get also this bloodstream infection that you didn't have when you came in. we think that the bloodstream infections largely come from the central line catheters that, when you're really sick in the ICU, are used to give you your medicine and your nutrients. And so, when you're putting in one of those catheters, you should wash your hands. Furthermore, you should drape the patient. Furthermore, you should use this super strong antiseptic. And furthermore, you shouldn't leave the catheter in longer than it needs to be there. Okay? Not rocket science. Evidence-based, duh. So they do this at Hopkins, and the bloodstream infection rate falls by about 1/3. And some doctors are saying, well, you know, I'm saving lives, right? And I don't have time to find the drapes for the patient or the antiseptic. So they put a cart in the intensive care units that has the drapes and the antiseptic. Bloodstream infections fall by another 1/3 of the original. And then they finally do this comprehensive unit-based safety program, which is, you know, continuous improvement, lean manufacturing kind of stuff, where first you measure the culture, I'll say more about that in a minute, you educate the staff on the science of safety, you have a senior executive partner to clear the path, we might get to some more about that in a minute, you start trying to fix things, you learn from one defect per month, this is a 6-month thing, and then you come back and you remeasure the culture. Okay, and so they got the bloodstream infection rate at Hopkins essentially down to 0. The state of Michigan Hospital Association called up and said, can you help us? The data that we're going to talk about are from 80-something% of the patient days. They're not from all the ICUs, but they're from a lot of the ICUs and a lot of the big ones. And they now have a national program rolling this out that thinks that it's saved, you know, thousands of lives and millions of dollars. And this national program involves Johns Hopkins how? Through a website. Okay, so this is not the admittedly very charismatic Peter Pronovost showing up in all these places. Okay, in fact, he didn't spend much time in Michigan either. Okay, so the timeline for the Michigan data is they show up and they measure the bloodstream infection rate before they do any interventions. They measure these safety attitude questionnaires, and so there's 63 or 65 questions or something. So one of them is, they're all on these 5-point scales. You ask everybody, agree or disagree, strongly or weakly. I frequently have trouble expressing disagreement with staff physicians in this ICU. Okay? Another one is, agree or disagree, strongly or weakly. Error reporting is rewarded in this ICU. Another one is, agree or disagree, strongly or weakly. Hospital administration doesn't knowingly put patients at risk. Okay, and the first two are about the care delivery team. The third one is about people in suits, not the care delivery team. And what we're going to do is, and then they do the 6-month, if you want, culture change, comprehensive unit-based safety program. And what we're going to do is look at how were the bloodstream infections before anything happened, and what were people's answers to questions like I just gave, and then they come back in 2 years, so that the intervention is really the bulk of the intervention within 6 months. We come back and we remeasure the bloodstream infection, and we look again at those questions. Okay? So this is the simplest possible first difference regression. You know, the identification police will beat me up all day long, but it's what I have, right? And so the question is, within an ICU, over time, from 2004 to 2006, what happens to central line associated bloodstream infections, the bad outcome, if answers to those questions go up or down? Okay, and so these are both outcomes, right? So we measure bloodstream infections and the answers to those questions before, and we're going to look at changes in both of them. And so the intervention is changing both of them, the bloodstream infection rate, and so I'm looking at, is there a correlation in the proxies for culture and the hard medical outcome of bloodstream infections as they change relative to where we started? So the answer is that there is. So bloodstream infections fell a lot. They went down, you know, from 2.86 per 1,000 catheter days to 1.58. And if your ICU is one that had improvements in those cultural questions, you're likely to be one that had improvements in your bloodstream infections, right? And so these are, you know, there's the one that says, I'm frequently unable to express disagreement with staff physicians in this ICU. So a 1 standard deviation change in the answer to that, you know, this thing fell by 1.3, right? Something like that. Well, that's almost half of the effect right there, right? Error reporting rewarded in this ICU. And these are 4 separate regressions so far, right? Where I put change in bloodstream infection on the left and change in one of these measures on the right. Okay, and I think these measures are, did we change an equilibrium? Right? Did we change whether it's okay to express disagreement? Or will you have a clog thrown at you or worse? No? Did we change whether error reporting is rewarded or penalized? Right? Did we change, here's the one that's hiding the hospital management doesn't knowingly put patients at risk. So all, you know, these are just getting bigger and bigger over here. So not everything works in this sense, but again, these are 4 separate regressions. What I think is also important is, and interesting, is you can put 2 of these 3 in at the same time and they both matter, right? So you shouldn't think that there's one amorphous, monolithic notion of culture and that all of these measures are proxying for it, right? I don't think these 2 together work, but this one and this one work together, and that one and that one and that one work together, right? So I think there's a multi-dimensional notion of culture here that's worth paying attention to. Okay, so in the remaining 4 minutes, I have 1 slide on bottom lines and then 2 slides about the future, sort of. So I'll try and sneak those in. So this is what we did, right? We talked about, do we have an organizational economy, not just a market economy? We talked about the sample selection idea that organizations are addressing the hard problems and you need to think of organizations as needing to manage their internal coalition. So from the Michigan work, thousands of lives and millions of dollars, right? They made organizations better. And the regression makes it look like, you know what? Maybe by changing how it is that we understand that we're going to work together, a shared sense of the appropriate exercise of discretion, it's not impossible to measure proxies from this stuff. And yesterday we were starting to try to model some of this, right? Okay, so last 2 slides, I want to offer you this way to try to knit everything together, right? So I like the Coase meets Heckman, the green and the purple and all that stuff. I like this even more, right? So if you're going to remember one thing from this, 1.5, right? The half would be Gibbons claims that culture matters for performance and that economists can maybe think about it. That's the half, okay? Here's the 1. So this is from my colleagues in the organizational studies group, and they use these 3 lenses, they call them, to think about managing real organizations, and they emphasize that you need to use all 3 of them. Okay, and I think this is important, and then I'll go to my last slide. So first lens is this cool blue rational design lens, right? And it says the organization is a machine. So maybe a pulley will break, but it won't go on strike, right? And so action comes through planning in their terms. And when I got to MIT, they said that's the economics view, right? And I said, wrong. That's the engineering view. That's the operations research view. That's the team theory view. So then the next lens is the red, hot, political. Organization is a contest, action comes through power. I say, yeah. That's the game theoretic view. Okay, that one I know. That's where organizational economics has been spending most of its time. And then you gotta love PowerPoint. Andy's squinting a little, right? I could make this even more light gray because it's hard to see, right? So the cultural lens, you know,
Is that certainty or is that?
I don't quite know what an institution is, but let's talk about institutionalized, right? Institutionalized means taken for granted. And so I don't love habit as the word down there, but you know, what things are taken for granted? Like, yeah, you know, that's the way it is in this ICU. You express disagreement with an intensivist, you're toast, right? Okay, so those are their lenses. So this is my last slide. So first of all, I think that Marshak and Radner in team theory and no incentive conflict was the first models in organizational economics were there. It's engineering, it's operations research. 30, 40 years of organizational economics has been doing game theory, And the managerial move here, it's exactly, this non-economist who was sitting right here, right? What the response is to these Arrow's theorem-like conflictual environments is not formulas or formal contracts, but promises or relational contracts. And so to actually tie back to yesterday, so how do you build one of those good equilibria? They're hard to describe. So when is it okay for the nurse to interrupt the doctor? Because if I'm the nurse and I interrupt you and the patient dies, this is not a good thing, right? So what's the appropriate exercise of discretion? So I think this light gray, taken for granted, shared understanding, developed maybe through stories, I think is a big deal. And so where I end up in this color that is reflecting, my current enthusiasm in all these slides is, I think the leader's job is to build, manage, and change equilibria, and I want to see evidence like that, and I'm trying to do a little bit, and I would like to see models too, because I think the way we make progress in economics is by a dialogue between the two. And it is 5:10, Robert. I'm done, man, on time.
We are now open for discussion, further open for discussion.
Yeah.
Your discussion of the bloodstream infection reminded me of the work of Atul Gawande.
Good, who is not the checklist guy.
Right.
He took it from Brunavust, go on.
Right,
I want to say more about
that's
this.
right. But he brought up the interesting analogy there about the airline safety record. That so these pilots, they take off these planes. There's a long list of checks. You do this,
Yeah.
this. You don't take off. Still everything. Like so many of us have suffered.
Yeah.
Sitting on tarmac because one little light is not working.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work. They don't take off.
Good.
So that's a certain kind of environment. What you're producing is this flight goes from here to here and then
Yeah.
they're done.
Yeah.
And when you go to hospital,
Yeah.
right, you've got scheduled surgeries, you got, it's gonna happen this day at this time, that's like a flight. But the emergency room is not,
Good.
right?
And yet,
Right,
they have a checklist.
yeah. they have-
Where are you headed?
Right.
A
So-
really bad airline.
Yeah.
Right,
Really
right.
bad.
So I was wondering about that, to what extent are we gonna say, that's how things are here, or they're just dealing with a different work environment?
Or is
Yeah.
that litigation proofness?
Right, okay,
You know,
yeah.
to defend yourself in case something goes wrong and you get sued. Oh, yeah, we went through this.
So what
Can
is
I just
that?
add to that? Because there have been these cases in recent years where there have been accidents because, particularly in some Asian cultures where you respect
Thank you,
procedures.
John. This is exactly where I want to go,
Yeah, the
right?
culture.
And I want to, so San Francisco Airport, I go in and out of there quite a bit,
Oh, yeah.
and it wasn't Korean Air. I mistakenly said this to a student from Korean Air. He said it was not us, but it was Asiana or somebody, and the co-pilot didn't say anything, okay?
Yeah, right,
Afraid to express disagreement in this cockpit.
yeah, so that's the culture,
Okay.
right, yeah.
Okay, here's the part that troubles me the most about Gawande. I'm sure Gawande's a wonderful doctor. He's an amazing speaker and writer. I hate the first part of that book because he talks about his stockbroker, right? So there are two roles for checklists, and in my view, he's emphasizing the wrong one.
Mm.
So individuals need checklists because of cognitive overload. Okay, check. Your stockbroker, whatever.
Right.
Great, fine. I hate that, right? Because it maybe, you saw the checklist, wash your hands.
Right, right.
Really? Is this about, and the airplane is much more complicated than
More
this
than that,
checklist. I don't think this checklist is about cognitive overload, and when you tell me a single person application, you gotta have two people to have culture, you gotta have a co-pilot. So I wanna be about what happens when somebody doesn't do the checklist? What are the second order norms? What am I supposed to do when you don't wash your hands?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So this view of culture seems, I guess, a bit smaller C than like a big C culture that I would
Good.
ordinarily think of.
Good,
And
and
seems a bit
you're
more.
an economist, yes? But
Yes.
you're pretending not to be when you talk about culture you would normally think of, or?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
But I guess this view also of culture as, like habit or story seems a bit like Nelson Winter-y,
Good.
routine-y.
Good.
And if we think about firms as these continuing businesses that need to maintain competitiveness over time, then they need to be able to change
Good,
their routines
you bet.
and their habits. So is this suggesting that then, you know, you're constantly reinventing your culture, or constantly having to redo over
Good.
and over your culture every time you need to change a routine? Or like, and is that, you know, these are small C's, we have to keep doing them over and over again versus like a big
Good.
C?
Okay, so you were there yesterday, right? Okay, so we got close to some of this, sort of, I want to say. But, so first of all, yeah, there are times when you need to change your equilibrium. I think that's a really hard problem. You said, oh, firms need to remain competitive. So hold on. Okay, let's think about that Chad Severson data, not about the airline kitchens, but you know, he's got micro data as far as the eye can see, right? And the summary in the JEL piece is the 90th percentile firm in a narrowly defined industry is making twice as much with the same inputs as the 10th percentile firm. So the first point is the laggards apparently are not catching up. The second point is the laggards are apparently not dying. So I think the third point is, you know, I think, you know, I just wasn't thinking well when I took micro before I ran away to organizations. I thought, you know, your firm has lower costs than mine, you're gonna kill me. It's all about your current lower costs. Wrong, right? It's not good enough for you to undercut my price on my customers. You still want to supply your customers. So I think expansion is a hard organizational problem, maybe as hard as catch-up. Because what the cost leader needs to do is open a new plant that's as good as the first plant that's serving their current customers in order to now serve my customers, right? And we saw the airline kitchens. This is not obviously easy, right? Which is what winter is about with replication, and it's a hard problem, right? So where I was trying to kind of go yesterday was, I don't think you can turn off one equilibrium and turn on the other. I think you need to be able to say, no, you know, we've had these core principles, and I can look back, you can look back at the actions I've taken and say, yeah, you know, Gibbons is within sight of living up to those as the situation varies. And now a big change in the world happens and we say, okay, you know, the implications of those core principles are now different, okay? And so don't imagine that relatively constant behavior by me in the past is going to get replicated now, but do understand that I claim I'm living up to these same principles throughout, right? So, yeah. And so yes, this is small c, right? But that's why I talked about Hofstede and the IBM and the French and the Belgian and the, you know, there's lots of big C out there, but I don't know what a manager or an economist does about those so much. So, yeah.
So your blood infection thing. So I don't see, we're not seeing how the change is made, but I don't see where leadership comes into
Good.
this.
Good. So, okay, and sort of it doesn't, and I like that. Right, so my daughter who thought, you know, as we've talked a lot about, you know, I have a daughter who lives here, was ballerina, all our kids think that athleticism is a skip generation trait, like their parents couldn't walk around the block, but they had grandparents who could, or something. So our younger sister was this big-time soccer player, went to the Julie Foudy Soccer Leadership Academy every chance she got, where they taught leadership is personal, not positional. Okay, so I think a hierarchically flat group has room for leaders. Okay, that's my first point. That you know, beginning to talk about, hey, aren't we collectively underperforming? You know, let's round up the tenured faculty and start talking. Forget the chair, forget the dean. All right, so that's an act of leadership. Is the first point, is to start that conversation. However, to be more hierarchical than that, there's a reason I put this in italics. Okay? So, my late colleague and friend Elizabeth Martinez was working with Pronovost at Hopkins. She died from 2 cancers in 2013, but she beat 2 bloodstream infections in the Boston hospital on the way there. So she was at Hopkins when they were doing this stuff, and she was in a different ICU than Pronovost. And they had a senior leader attached to their ICU team to smooth the path, right, who was hopeless, okay? And they had to replace him and get somebody good, okay? And notice that our regression goes nowhere if the right-hand side variable is the same for every ICU, right? This is all about heterogeneous treatment effects, okay? They all run the same, the intervention is intended to be the same from Hopkins' point of view. But if it achieved the same change in the right-hand side variable, like the change in I frequently have trouble expressing disagreement, I've got no variation in my right-hand side variable. Okay, so this regression works because different ICUs experience different changes in these proxies for culture. Where might that come from? Different effectiveness of those characters, among other sources, right? So I think leadership can be flat, not hierarchical. I think there's an important role for hierarchical leaders here, and I think that helps you get to how to understand the heterogeneous treatment effect that it's easy to forget are very much in these data we wouldn't have a regression without.
So it's a little bit tempting to think that we really are talking about blueprints here. You start with the checklist, and then you say, now here we've discovered that also the nurses have to feel comfortable telling the doctor.
Excellent. Now where are you going with that?
Well, once you know that, then
Finish that sentence, all important.
you make it happen.
Terrible! Terrible! Come on! I spent 5 minutes digressing about light switches. Come on.
The doctors, the senior executives are supposed to say, well, we have a longer checklist. The checklist involves
Good.
telling the,
Let's imagine that 3 deans ago you had an utter dictator. Just, I know nothing, I'm just making this up.
we have a new one.
Who, you know, was behaving in arbitrary and capricious and self-interested ways all the time, okay? Suppose that dean comes back from a site visit somewhere else and says, I've got religion, all you department chairs, you know. Baloney, right? I mean, eyes rolling back in the, sorry, yeah?
I said yes, right, because our chancellor recently issued a note, an email to all of us saying that now we were gonna have shared governance.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, let's, we have 2 minutes to unpack shared governance?
Sure.
Okay, so that's perfect, because I think both of the words that I try to talk about, credibility and also clarity,
Right.
are hiding in there, right? So let's suppose, again, I have no idea, and let's, I don't really want to talk about the current administration, but suppose that chancellor has a horrendous record of unshared governance heretofore. So there's a massive credibility problem, like, oh really, right? That's number one. Making the nurses feel like they can express disagreement is not a light switch. You don't come back from your site visit and flip that on, right? But then, the other thing in shared governance is, so what does that mean?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. It's
utter-
gonna mean that the administration appoints faculty members. That's what it seems like.
It might.
Well,
So,
I mean, so you know, empowering the nursing team helps. But why is that hard to do?
Good.
Well, it's probably hard to do because the culture in the operating room is built around, we're saving lives and we don't need interruptions.
some places got it done.
Well, since they did get it done, you would think it would be, let's replicate this. And you
Good.
go talk to the surgeons and you tell
Good.
them, here's what's working. And because they're surgeons and they're men and women of science, they
Yeah.
look at the data and they say
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Like I said, this is evidence-based, right? This is data, and yet doing just that did not yield absolutely, right? So you're watching me live my life here, right? So Bob Solow used to say when he listens to Milton Friedman, he starts talking like John Kenneth Galbraith, and when he listens to Galbraith, he starts talking like Friedman. So you know, I'm an economist, but I hear this and I start talking like Tim Bogus over here, you know, about, you know, let's think about culture in organizations. On the other hand, when I go visit organizations, people, okay. So, you know, shared governance works for me, right? I think there are all kinds of problems, right? Will the doctors actually believe that this is the secret sauce or part of it, right? There's the pushback is, no, my patients are sicker, or, you know, I doubt the doctors are gonna tell me this, but
A lot of cognitive
what's your stupid first difference regression, you're not well identified, or whatever, right?
Yes.
And then, you know, it's somebody else, it's not me. And maybe it isn't you. Maybe you never threw a clog at anybody for interrupting. Let's talk about second order norms. Did you ever call out one of your peers for throwing a clog? Right, so, you know, what are we, building a shared understanding of how we're gonna interact is way not trivial, right? And our fault, I think, or problem as at least model builders in economics is, I don't know how to say that. I don't know how to build a model of that, and I want to do that.
Well, my question is, so you need leadership, but that's a real black box, is your.
Good, which is, so
Right there.
very small c, right? I'm trying to be concrete about a thing that we could model and maybe think about and maybe do, right? And that, again, I think it's very important to remember that some of that leadership can be hierarchically flat and not
Right. No,
this
that's
character.
surely
All right. Yeah.
Let me sort of come back to this flatness, because, and I think Bob may have much more knowledge about this than I do. My understanding is that in Vietnam, that individual platoons on the planning stage would act in a very flat mode. This was at least some platoons, let's say, acted in a very flat mode, everybody basically having equal authority to make suggestions, to discuss them. But when they went into the field,
Good.
they immediately became hierarchical. It's the underlying authority of the different ranks in there. Of course, there is this repeated argument that they're not leading people into the wrong fight, that they can make good instantaneous decisions. So part of leadership is that it's not always being applied. It's not always being used. It's allowing the flatness to operate when there's, in some sense, time, flexibility, room to allow it, but then being able to make authoritative decisions that don't kill people too often, when there's very little time and decision-making is. So this, it's not, I think that looking only for flatness would be missing the situation that there are other places where it has become very vertical.
And I think
And that would be true in an organization and a corporation as well as in.
I agree with that totally. I think you can think about, I don't know what shared governance means in exactly those terms. I think you and I are now using leadership in two different ways. I mean to be talking about little L leadership right here, which is, it is an act of leadership to help a group build a new equilibrium. And
Right.
that can be flat.
I understood the
But-
difference between these
yeah,
two, and I was
yeah.
thinking that
Yeah.
that there's two types of
I
this
agree.
leadership.
I agree.
Small question. But to the extent leaders are elected, so you have this culture, the cultures elect the leaders they deserve. If you're talking about.
La 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 la.
You're talking about.
We'll know in November.
Right, yeah. You're talking about, implementing change through leadership, but,
I spent a week in Spain giving 4 talks, and only on the last night, maybe they were colluding, did anybody mention the election. And so they were very kind.
But you can talk about department chairs too, they're elected too.
There you go.
So.
Further discussion in this room, or shall we retire and discuss over wine and food? Well, thank you very much.
I'm good.
that was the more economic side.
I like the yesterday's one more than.
Yeah.
Yep. No, and I meant, right, my flat thing was little, and you're, let's get it done. It's-
But they coexist. One of them is flexing the other form under situations where decisions have to be made out.
Yeah.
So
I
you
think
have to
that
actually be
we- I
solving
think
for both.
we're agreeing that we need big L in some situations. And in a way, it's an act of further big L leadership by that guy to let the flat thing happen.
Right, but that's where he gets more information, so that was the idea.
I don't mean it's mysterious, I mean it's
Right.
hard to avoid intervening if you're really that guy. And I do wanna keep our eye on something where there is no that guy, right? You gather the tenured professors who've been here, you know, like at MIT, the department chair really has no expertise.